Thursday night too?
It's a public hearing.
Yeah.
That usually lasts about 2 hours. It starts at 6.
I would think, I don't think it might be less. We don't require people to register. But it helps this, lower hearing to do.
Remember that being very long,
No.
especially the first one.
Right, usually it takes a little bit to get into it. They were submitted later Friday afternoon, and he told me he just sent them to Patty. I hadn't gotten them by the time he came upstairs. They are forthcoming.
Okay, I didn't have any of those.
I know. No, you didn't.
Okay, but, so are the questions attached here?
All of the questions?
No, the ones that were submitted later.
Oh, no, they're not in there. I just sent the responses that we've gotten.
Get it the next round, right?
Oh, I'll get it to you tomorrow. As soon as I get it, I'll send it out to everyone.
Thanks.
Hello, how are you? How are you doing? This is kind of crap, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I know.
You have to spread out.
Another table, but I forgot.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Just so you know, these are all the responses that we've received. There's another set of questions that was added on to this because they were submitted later in the afternoon on Friday. And Vern completed them and sent them to Patty, but I haven't gotten them.
She was having a hard time.
I'll send them out to everybody as soon as I get them.
Okay.
Well, maybe she connected.
this
Did you?
Real tight, yeah.
was inside.
Really?
These
Okay.
are the responses to the questions.
So here's everybody's.
Yeah, it's Deborah, if everyone's fun to show up.
And then you got these books here,
They were the.
and Willard's not here, or is she?
And so, and Vern was looking at all the responses, and he said what he had, but I had by the time I came up here. So, they're forthcoming.
Do you want to stay at the table?
No.
We can move over to,
No, you're a parent.
Oh.
Make sure you sit.
It has
thank you.
Yeah.
Vern, because he's scrolling through the budget
People
as
come
we
in.
talk about it.
So this is.
Do you have a flash drive?
What?
I said it to Deb.
There's a table sitting right out there that we could grab.
This one.
Yeah, but it's not set up for the microphone. Oh, that's
I'm
good.
gonna get to that. What? Brian.
Computer is this.
We'll see how it works out.
It's communication.
Maybe some.
I emailed it to Deb. That program is right. So she was doing it.
It was a
You always
program by city that we did.
Brian said it to me.
Program.
I mean, you got it.
I don't know if they
Okay.
actually heard it. I don't remember the name, but I can find it. Okay.
Do you mind?
That would be the easiest.
Run down and
Here's a fun. Yeah.
It's all right. It's all right. Just leave it. Yeah, just leave it. It's not
Right.
Nothing, just straight up water.
The meeting's more interesting.
Juice that up a bit.
Okay.
You run fast.
Oh,
You
okay.
run up the
Okay.
stairs.
Then I'll talk to Ron about it. Around our relationship with the county.
That's okay. I didn't have time to shop.
We are working on job registry.
I was gonna go to Wegmans.
That's coming in.
But I'm gonna get you Wegmans before you get me lunch, I'm sure.
Okay. 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 Okay.
Oh,
I'll
okay.
reach out to you.
Yeah, we should have to watch. I think that,
Sorry about that.
You got your big shoe. You can share.
that's all the
Oh, I
rate.
did because he knows the
Hey,
budget better
that's
than
what,
I
that's all
do.
the rate, that's what we talked about.
Oh, okay.
So I thought about you guys on the comedian.
Okay. All right. So you gonna share with Mary?
Sharing it up with you over the weekend.
Oh, so you gotta give Mary some of your time?
Man's not chairing the meeting, so I don't have to worry about getting yelled at.
This is for you.
Okay.
Thank you. Please take it home.
Thank you, sir.
Jackie Morgan will be.
Okay.
She'll be mad at
Let
me.
me see what it is.
She said, make sure that everybody comes
Okay. Vern, how you doing? How are you?
Mike is working.
Pardon?
Mike is working.
reading priorities for my third grade. Actually got a presentation I should share with you. So should we get ESA or what's the right form?
That's an ESA.
ESA. So should I have somebody from the administration check?
Malik.
ESA now. No, but I'm talking about the staff person. That cuts it.
No,
Oh,
Kim.
Deborah.
Kim.
They switched some stuff around.
So we'll reach out to Kim
Okay.
as the coordinator. So, okay, so it'll be Katerina, Katie, and Ray.
And I would then
Right.
suggest you're right.
So, but we're meeting tomorrow, right?
Yeah,
I think so.
yeah, that's on follow.
Right, yeah, okay. All right.
They have like a deeper level.
Yes, oh, absolutely.
So I would think you'd want to get.
Tell you to behave.
Yep, absolutely.
I had a couple of fish there, so I'm trying to find my rock.
That's a long wait for a glass of wine.
For your eyes on. Is that in relation to something that we've been dealing with? I don't want to. You can email it to me. I don't want it. I don't want it. Let's talk about it. You can take it. And you can call me and tell me what it's about.
I mean, yeah, I can call her if you want. Let me see if she's here.
Oh, okay.
Who? Oh, Willa?
Thank you,
Yeah, I'm all right.
Chair. She's usually here. Sometimes
Yeah.
when she's not here, you know, something could have come up.
Yeah, we got an email 15 minutes ago from Sinead saying the meeting is by telephone conference tomorrow.
Let's have a couple of fish sandwiches.
It's a telephone conference. She gives you the link. And then all those questions that I had asked, text, so they know most of the questions. Hey, Willa, are you on your way? Okay.
I don't know.
All right, I'll let everyone know. Bye-bye. Here?
She's running.
Willa's one turn away. She'll be here in a minute.
Okay. Oh, okay, great. Okay. What does the 3-year average mean?
Over that 3-year period.
Oh, number of days.
What is this? What is this?
Oh,
Days of what?
number of days of absence?
What is this?
Oh, oh.
So the first column is
Oh.
what was
Oh.
this year.
Let's get this party started, Mr. President.
She's one turn away. She's coming in now.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
You don't use it, you do?
Yeah.
You kidding me? Cash out vacation? Seriously, you get, for example, if I'm doing this one,
You're done, exactly.
and if I want to carry over a couple of days, that was beer.
Or you have another boss just goes
Right,
in and
exactly.
take it.
But they say if you have to take it to work.
Yeah, I mean, so you
The following year. Now, I mean, well, with no,
from over here.
so I don't know how that works.
I can't remember.
I was one more.
People I had to
For SEG,
pay
because
out
I know
to
the
vacation time, so you got towards the end of the
change
year.
it, change it.
And I went through several
okay.
times right after
Right,
Friday.
yeah.
Improvement.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's why. Very good though, Deb.
Yeah.
Mary, sent you a draft. I sent you a draft. That's why I'm like, actually, because it took longer than I thought it would.
It's about
Thank you.
cell on the floor.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's-
thank you.
We are going to do responses to the additional questions that were submitted later on Friday. They're forthcoming.
Okay, very good.
And they would take a day vacation.
Thank you for everyone for your patience and indulgence. I'm sorry I'm late. CFO Bill Ansbro and I talked on the phone earlier today, and we'd like to start the deliberations with a brief presentation from Bill bringing us up to speed on the conference bill that was presented to the governor, and whether we anticipate him signing that budget, or what the state of affairs is now versus the assumptions that were made when the budget was compiled. Bill?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman, and I provided each of the board this document here. I apologize. I thought myself I actually emailed this to Deb, thinking she was controlling the slide, but it's Vernon. So I don't have an electronic version, but I could get one. I could easily get one for later in the meeting, and I have to run downstairs and forward it. So what this shows is that the governor's budget that he put forward and provided $510 million to our district, and then the enacted budget that resulted the input from the state legislature increased that amount to $521.7 million. So that's an increase of $11.5 million. The board will remember that when the superintendent presented to you his draft budget, we assumed a $3.5 million increase in state aid. So the increase above our assumption was $8 million. So that's what this number to the far right shows, an increase of $8 million above what we showed. The breakout of that is detailed. The largest increase is in foundation aid. There's also an increase in building aid. The increase in building aid needs some additional verification to make sure the timing of that is correct, that we are counting it in the correct fiscal year. We believe we may actually be getting sort of 4 payments instead of 2 in 14-15, so that needs some additional discussion. And so the bottom line is an increase in $8 million above what we assumed in our draft budget. So it certainly is, the CFO, it would be my counsel to be reflective of. Remember, when we presented the draft budget to you, we proposed using an additional $8.4 million of our fund balance. You know, that was not knowing, you know, where we were going to be with the state aid. We had some good hope for additional funding. It was important that we put forward a budget that provided stability, so that was a reflection there. So it would certainly be my suggestion that we give serious consideration to you know, backing off, you know, that additional use of fund balance, and instead, you know, replacing it with an ongoing revenue stream from the state aid. I know during this process there will be a lot of conversation about what we submitted in the draft budget, but at a high level, from a financial perspective, I think we should give consideration to that. Especially, you know, we have a number of increases in 15-16. We'll have an increase in the teacher retirement system and cost. Remember, we opted into the smoothing. The smoothing provided us with 2 years of fixed for TRS. It goes up at 15-16, you know, that rate. And then we do anticipate about a $9 million increase in charter school cost as well at 15-16. So having those resources available at that time, I think, would be prudent. The other thing I need to update the board on is that, you know, our charter school tuition rate assumption assumed that the rate would be frozen. That proved to be the case, at least as far as our fiscal impact. The state budget provides for an additional $250 per pupil supplemental support for the charter schools, but the state would pay for that. It would not come out of our existing revenue streams. So the fiscal impact of that, you know, proved to be neutral. And then we have some other opportunities that are like line item budgets that could further assist us. But I think we need to wait until the governor actually, you know, signs the budget before we delve too deeply into those items. Typically, you know, you would see about 10 days or so goes by before you know, it will be signed into law. As I'm sure you know, he could single out certain things and veto them. So that's where we are on the state budget. I think I certainly want to thank the board and our legislatures for all their efforts in getting our voice heard. I know the superintendent, he may want to comment as well. You know, he when we went to Albany, we asked for 13.6. You know, we got 11.5. You know, I think we did fairly well. So I think that's a reflection of everybody's efforts, rallied behind, and people understood our circumstances. So that's my opening comments, Mr. Superintendent.
I just want to thank you to the board and to also Bill and his team and also members of the staff for the effort that went into this process. And as you can see, it's a work in progress. So I look forward to the board discussion and question. And I appreciate the question that you have been raising, and hopefully as a result of this, we will have a final approved budget that meet the needs of our students. I just wanted to caution us the same challenge that we are facing now. The good news is that we got some additional funding. The observation that I want to make is about that our total increase, 60% or more went just to the charter school allocation. And as we look into the future, we need to understand that that's even likely to increase. I project that not into the too far future, potentially we could be in a situation that every dollar that this organization receives from the state could be transferred to charter school, which we present an interest in the level. So as we're thinking about closing the budget gap and bringing stability to the district, I want all of us to be mindful for that, because when you put a budget together, you can't just think about today. You have to think about tomorrow. And again, thank you to Bill and to everyone, and to particularly the board and Commissioner Power for the incredible amount of work and dedication that you have. And I look forward to getting as much input as possible from the public as well.
Thank you. I think your thanks are a little premature, since this is day one, hour one of our deliberation process. It's scheduled to go on over the course of the next month. I was going to refrain from joking that about the new definition of a tuition freeze, because if we had that kind of freeze where we could actually increase our aid and still call it a freeze, we would probably be sitting in a pretty good place right now. But since that's not the case, I acknowledge that your advice and counsel on essentially substituting the $8 million in new revenue for what had been budgeted as a draw from our reserves it is indeed prudent, because our reserves are razor thin. But it's also fair to say that over the course of this month, both the administration and the board are going to be exercising a little bit of a tug of war as we prioritize what we want to spend money on, and possibly the final answer will be something in between, restoring all of the fund balance and using it to provide more funding for our priorities. So with that overview, I'd like to remind the board that my process is to allow the board to ask questions on the sections we're planning on covering, in this case sections 1 through 3, essentially until the questions are exhausted or we are exhausted, whichever comes first. So we can, in fairness to everyone, one of the best ways to keep people awake and alert is to allow each person to ask one question at a time, and walk our way through the sections in that fashion. So at the risk of putting Commissioner Cruz on the spot, since he is on my far left, would you like to start us off, Commissioner, with a first question in section 1? keep in mind for the audience, and most of, if not all of the audience is district administration, but we are streaming on the internet. The board did submit questions in advance and received some answers in advance. There were late submissions, and a packet of answers to the late submissions is forthcoming. I don't know that anyone has had truly sufficient time to read over the compiled questions and answers any more than we've had sufficient time to review the budget. But having said that, we do have an extensive packet to work from. Commissioner Cruz?
Thank you, Chappelle. The question, the questions are pretty extensive, and there's a lot of information that got back, and just trying to sort of process all this stuff is going to take some time to do. But can you give me?
Yeah, can you speak up? Either speak up or into the mic or both.
Can you give me just an update on the really as a result of these kinds of emails that were going back and forth on the early childhood director, what the status of that is and what the rationale, because I'm not sure how much of it there is misinformation about that particular position, but what's going on with that, and because the indication is that there was a elimination of that position, and I just want to hear from you guys what's going on with that and what the rationale is. Guys as in gender neutral, by the way.
Yeah.
Make sure that was pointed out.
Thank you. Briefly, just we have been, the position is recommended to be cut. The function is not. And we are asking, actually I've been meeting with people in the early childhood education, and there's no one in this community who disagree with me that pre-K is not the totality of early childhood education, and that you need an integrated approach if we are going to accomplish our goal to get our children to read on grade level by 3rd grade. Just like you need to address the summer learning loss, because people will tell you that you can give a child a pre-K program, but if that child spends the summer without any educational activity or reading or engage in that, good research will tell you that about a quarter will fade away. And so we are basically advocating or recommending to this board to have a position. Again, the function of the people in that office, the majority of the, none but the head of the pre-K is the only position that is being recommended in the budget. I believe it's the only position to be cut, so that we can, in our new redesign, to have someone that is we can hold accountable to achieve the most important goal for this organization, I believe. It's not necessarily a graduation rate, because graduation rate won't improve in this district unless you give our children the foundation that they need, such as getting them to read on grade level by 3rd grade. And also our emphasis in investment is so significant. As you can see, this summer alone would be a groundbreaker should this board adopt the budget as our recommendation, which is to provide every child in an opportunity, K-3, a summer enrichment reading activity.
So Dr. Argus, then who, just help me to understand that, where does the ultimate accountability lie for early childhood? Whose hands?
With the director of 3rd grade reading.
So that individual will be responsible for
the coordination and leading that unit, leading that effort, in which you, again, Rochester have been doing it, and the question that we need to ask ourselves, what happened by 3rd grade? And if our intervention doesn't get integrated in a very robust, as I mentioned, including the summer learning loss, and also the all this strategy that we have in place, that we are not going to get to where we need to be. And I'm beginning to see some result even today. I visited about 7 schools, and one of the things that I heard from the students was that they felt that they were ready for that test. And I asked the student and I asked the staff, and they felt that a lot of work had been gone on to get our student ready, but that's required an integrated approach. You can no longer have a siloed approach to anything that we do because of for one thing, I could tell you that you haven't yielded the result that we need and want and desire for our students.
Is there anyone who'd like to ask a follow-on question to UPK?
My immediate question is, so this person is going to be focused on the administration of all UPK plus all of the initiatives that are to get kids reading by 3rd grade.
Number one, it's not one person, so I think it would be wrong to characterize that it's a unit.
Would you be restructuring that unit?
Yeah, correct. The unit, the way that we have the district, when I first arrived, there was one person responsible for K-12, for English language art. I don't need to tell you that by all accounts, we have, basically in the last budget, we had 2 positions. We began to make some progress, and we had a person right now that is was concerned with the high school, and another person with the K-8. What we are looking for is for a model that we use an integrated approach in which that person would be leading a unit with multiple people. We a very well-staffed office with different components. So that person not only will be managing, but will be leading, because you need certain leadership capacity, and a person that has an understanding of pre-K as well as an understanding of kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and also that could lead and coordinate all the effort that we need to execute in order to achieve our goal to get our students to read on grade level by 3rd grade.
Is there any way we could get an idea of what that structure would look like in order to figure out what the workflow or how things are going to be structured differently based on how they are now?
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
On the same time?
Yeah, just on the same topic. I think that it's important. I'm all in favor of cross-functional teams. I think that organizations like this operate in silos, but I do have some concerns about, not some, but many, just only because I've been following early childhood since I got on the board. I've been in liaison for the early childhood program for 10 years. So I'm very familiar, intimately familiar with the department, how early childhood works, and the work that's been done in the recognition that we've gotten on the national level for our work in early childhood. So I'm a little concerned about making any substantial changes to the current structure of early childhood. I think the one thing that we could do and that we should do is we should have these cross-functional teams. I think that definitely it should be part of a continuum in terms of pre-K to 3rd grade. And I'm wondering why we're not doing that now. I thought we were doing that now in terms of making sure that people from Beverly Shop that are on the higher levels are sitting with the pre-K people now to talk about what could be done so that transition could be made. I just don't see how one individual could be responsible for grade level reading in pre-K when that is such a major nut to crack. So I have serious concerns in terms of changing that structure. Just let me say, overall, I think this is a pretty good budget overall. Just from reading, I have some other concerns that I'll mention earlier when we get to the first 3 sections. But that's one of the ones that really rings major alarm bells for me, and I would be very reluctant to support such a drastic change in terms of pre-K. I just think that is setting us up for some of the areas of best practices. And I'd be interested to see too, maybe how other districts are doing it. What evidence is there that works? So if there are other districts that are following that model, if we could get that would be great. But I just want to be honest, so we won't. I know I'm always rushing stuff, but I just don't want to. And if the board doesn't have an appetite for that, I'd rather us put it up there up front, so that way it's not something that we're doing later in the budget process. So if the board doesn't have an appetite for restructuring something so drastically in terms of pre-K, and I'm just being honest and saying I really don't have an appetite for that. I want to be respectful of the administration and of my colleagues, trying to put that on the table now, so that way it's not something that, that we blindside you about, or we go back and say, hey, Mr. Superintendent, we're not going for that. So we can get these conversations up now. I think we have a tendency sometime to wait till the last minute to kind of resolve these issues. But I'll tell you, that raises, and I'm speaking as someone who's been intimately familiar. I mean, I've been to the pre-K folks can tell you, I've been to the parent meetings, I've sat in on parent meetings. I sat in on a parent meeting, I think once when Commissioner Adams, before you were on the board with your husband who came to one of the parent meetings. So I'm just very familiar with the process and the way things work. So I'm not speaking as someone who's not familiar with pre-K, but I just feel as though I need to echo the concerns of a lot of people about that restructure.
In the interest of following through on your suggestion that the board give some sense of its posture on that issue, why don't we just go the rest of the way down the line, and I'll articulate that my perspective is similar to yours, Commissioner Evans, but different in this respect. My skepticism is in treating kindergarten and pre-K the same as we treat first, second, and third grade. Pre-K and kindergarten are essentially, as far as I can tell, still setting the child up for the conditions of learning and building a common base of understanding and of the world. I'd be very skeptical of a model that lumps kindergarten and pre-K in with the early grades, because there's already a movement to push the learning tasks that had been first and second grade down into kindergarten first, down into pre-K and kindergarten, when that makes it, so far as I've been able to discern, not being an educator, that's not necessarily developmentally appropriate. So that's where my skepticism lies, and I think for me the case still has to be made, a compelling case still has to be made for putting those two functions under the same umbrella.
I'll just point this out, and then the administration can configure it the way it feels it wants to recommend. And I don't know if this is already a part of the thinking, but when you look at universal pre-K, the issue becomes, what happens if they're on, studies show that they have been on an equal playing field, and then when they get to the third grade, we've got some issues. I don't know if there's been research specifically around those students who have gone through pre-K, and then to track them from first, second to third to determine if they continue to be if they are at grade level. But that would be something that I would think that we need to look at. We've got this money. There's this push around universal pre-K, but there's also this notion that when they're in the third grade, the scores show that they're below level, and so somehow we've got to investigate that, to research that, to see if in fact we're spending our money appropriately. Because even though money is being spent on universal pre-K, there's got to be some conversations about what happens when they get into 3rd and 4th grade. So I don't know if that's a conversation for this year in this budget, but that's certainly something that we're going to have to look at in the future.
Actually, I would just mimic what Commissioner Elliott just said and use it as a means to compliment the administration that your goal of wanting to address reading readiness, which has been thematic for you for quite some time. We've got to get our kids ready. Otherwise, they're not going to graduate. The literature, the research is very clear. If the kids are not ready in 3rd grade, they're not going to be graduating on time. You can almost lay a good bet on that. So I think the emphasis that you have put, even in attempting to reconfigure this department, which is on early childhood learning, is critical. Because I think what Commissioner Elliott said is true, and I've even heard you say that. That's where I learned this, that by the time they get to 3rd grade, I've heard you say this multiple times, everything that every advantage that they received as a result of our excellent pre-K program, which is a model pre-K program, all that stuff dissipates by the time they get to 3rd grade, or a lot of it does. So I think your efforts to create a department or a leader on early childhood learning is excellent. But I don't think these are mutually exclusive approaches. I think you should do that. And if it means we end up having to pay the salaries of 2 separate people, so be it. Because I think you're right. I think we have to do that. We have to look at from pre-K to 3rd grade. But at the same time, I am convinced that you don't disregard what is, I got to be honest, one of the few things that we can talk about in this community that is positive about this district is our pre-K program. I mean, systemically, it's one of those few things that is working. And what's the old phrase? I've got a little NyQuil or DayQuil in me, but you don't fix what is broke, what is not broken. It ain't broke. Thank you, Malik. If it ain't broke, don't break it. Yeah, it's Ricardo. Whatever analogy you want to use, I think it's probably appropriate here that this is a team, this is an operation that is not broken. And I would really be concerned that if we changed something that didn't require change, that we might lose one of the few things that everybody looks at this district and says, hey, they're way ahead of the game. So, but I don't want to end on that point. I want to end on the point that I think your notion of creating something more comprehensive that addresses the problem that we have in this district, but that specifically to it, that when these kids get to 3rd grade, all this stuff is gone. I was at Mayor Warren's meeting the other day, and we were talking about pre-K, and we were talking about early childhood education, and I said, why are we sitting here? That's what I said. Why are we sitting here talking about pre-K? Well, respectfully, I appreciate the mayor's involvement, but that is not an area where we need improvement. And so what I said to that commission, that council that I sit on, is we need to focus, like you're talking about, on early childhood education. That's where the problem is. The problem isn't in pre-K. So again, do what you need to do on early childhood learning, because I think you are definitely onto something. But I would respectfully suggest that we do not mess with something that is working in this district. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
So first I want to acknowledge in the pre-K world that I appreciate those 10 parent group leader positions that were added using the grant. I think, we have a lot to celebrate that this grant was achieved, and, kudos to the early childhood department and to the district for being able to get that grant. I mean, this is a huge thing to celebrate. Again, as Van said and others have said, this is something we do well, we're known for doing well, and now we have an opportunity to take it to the next level. And it doesn't make any sense to break up the leadership of a really good program. And I would argue, and we talk about it repeatedly, that especially for the early grades, we believe that parent involvement and support with our youngest children really could be the key to success, as much as the arguments over curriculum and implementation of particular curriculum and assessments and so on. I believe it and take it into action that parents really do hold the key. So to that extent, having those extra parent group leaders is really important. I've always argued that in an ideal world, we would have them in kindergarten also, so that that fragile empowerment of parents and that the teaching that goes on could be bridged into kindergarten, where a student will be for the next 6 or 8 years, would be a really beautiful thing. And if we could look at integration of parent support, parent education, the parent group leader model between pre-K and kindergarten, I think that would go as far as anything. And the leadership for that model is within our existing pre-K organization. And so to see that through, to see that application and expansion of parent empowerment, parent education, parent leadership within our elementary schools, K, 2, 3, and on up, that's just a very specific line of concern in terms of disassembling the preschool parent, actually the overall pre-K, universal pre-K organization. Because if you mess with the leadership and the structure, then that also has ripple effects with the people who are leaders of the Rochester Parent Preschool Program. It would really send, I'm fearful of really chaotic ripples through the whole organization when we need steadiness and expansion.
Having heard some feedback from each of the board members, Dr. Vargas, do you have enough feedback to stand by your recommendation or to consider what you need to do from here?
Just one clarification. I don't know if the board be interested into. I heard some commissioner mention the Office of Early Child Education, and actually the name is right. The expert in early child education will tell you probably the argument will be from 0 to 8. Doesn't stop on 4 or begin on 4. So I do think that for quite some time and again, I had the same accolade for the program. I actually was in the board like you were advocating for integrating the community-based organization to be part of that. And some of the leader knows that because that was the only way that we were able to do it in Rochester. By no means I'm saying that we're eliminating the program, that we don't need it. I'm just saying that I do believe that the expert, like someone asked the question about the structure and also research and everything, will tell you that if you operate an early child education program on the basis that it's a pre-K program is part of, an integral part, an important part, or an early child education. And just like kindergarten or pre-K in this state, it's no mandate. So there have been a lot of confusion over the year, and district have taken different approaches because it's one of the situations where the funding might be driving the approach. And I'm sorry to say that if we were to design something differently, well thought out, you will use an integrated approach so that the people view themselves as part of that continuous system approach. And that as I kept, for example, attendance for pre-K wasn't even maintained, which at the district level, it was maintained at different level, but which is, and we have an incredible attendance system in here that we could do incredible work. But I just give that as an observation that I think that we're going to, I hear clearly, Commissioner Power, that what you're saying, I hear the board very clearly, but I would say that for now, let's keep an open mind about what's the best solution to get to improvement. And when I say improvement, I'm talking about that task that President White talked about, which is getting our children to read on grade level by 3rd grade. And by the way, this summer learning approach also had to be integrated as part of that, as part of that early childhood education. I'm not calling just summer school. Actually, you will see similar practice that we're asking for the summer, that good practice that had to take place during the school year as well. So I hear you, and I understand, and I respect and honor your decision. I just think that this sometimes gives us an opportunity to reflect and see where we are and where we need to be. But one last thing that I wanted to say, no one will say that early childhood education is begins or ends in pre-K.
Commissioner Cruz, thank you for starting us off with a question that was so near and dear to all of us. And since we've all had a chance to react to that, would you like to put out your next question?
Sure.
You may pass if you like.
Well, I think this, I think something that probably, I think it's time for my next question / suggestion. But I think one of the things that we're seeing in this district is an increase in Latino students. We're seeing an increase in a different kind of Latino student than we have over the past number of years. And I think we're seeing students coming in from the island, from Puerto Rico, obviously with the necessities that they do have. Puerto Rico right now is undergoing some major transformation with a lot of families moving off the island and coming to different places like Rochester or New York City or Florida. And with it, they're bringing students who are, they're not young. They're students who are in middle grades or even in high school. And we know that there have been some difficulties at some of our high schools with even Latino students from here and Latino students coming from elsewhere, bringing in a sense of conflict. We're also seeing students coming in from areas where the literacy rate in their own language has been even shortchanged. So I think we're seeing a different kind of Latino student coming in. I think we're seeing one with major necessities. And one of the things that we have to get good at in this district is figuring out what the strategies are going to be for addressing those kinds of variations of that theme. And so I'm suggesting very strongly at this point, and I'm urging my colleagues to take a look at this as well, but that we put together a strategy that really supports those issues with regard to Latino achievement in this district. And I'm asking you to take a look at even creating a kind of position that would be something in the vein of a director of Latino student achievement for the district with a high level of report and direction from you. Because I think this issue is that critical. I don't know how you would do that. It's not my business to tell you how you do that. But I think the challenge to you and your staff is to come back to, at least to me specifically, and I don't know about my colleagues because they need to make their decisions on how they want to support this, if they want to support this. But I think to come back and say, these are the kinds of things we want to do. Now, I would assume that based on the number of staffing that we have in things like our bilingual department and ELA department and all those things, that probably you can achieve this in a budget neutral way. I don't know, I'm throwing that out. And if that's the case, that's even better. But if we do have to support this position with additional financial supports, then I think it's a wise investment on our part and would go a long way, to be honest with you, in terms of getting my support for the overall budget. That's how important and critical I think it is, me personally, again. So I just want to hear from you in terms of what your reaction to that is. And obviously I'm putting you on the spot tonight about that, and we still have this is early in the process, so this is really good that we're coming up with these kinds of issues early and not wait until the last week for Bill Ambrose to lose more sleep than he already does on these things. But I think it's early enough to take a look at so we can make those kinds of adjustments now, coming to the budget time. So.
That will be noted in our minutes so that we can follow up on it as an action item.
Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to get some reaction.
And I will provide you the reaction, there's no question, as you articulated, that there are significant needs for improvement in the district or all students, but the Latino student population have specific needs, as you alluded to, in terms of the changing in population, new arrival that are coming daily, weekly, monthly to Rochester, so that they are the needs for specific attention. So what I will ask is to give me some time to react and get back to you on the board.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really has brought this point home, and it was some work that your staff did with some analysis of things like attendance rates amongst Latino students. We have the lowest attendance rate in the district.
Regents
By region scores. I mean,
Lowest
if you look at all of the indices, our Latino students are doing very poorly. So I think there's something going on. I think that's something that we have to specifically address, and I look forward to hearing how you plan on doing that. But again, I think part of it is, and I'll shut up after this, but I think part of it is to create some sense of focus, much in the same way that you talked about, Dr. Vargas, the whole idea of accountability and whose lap it should fall on. And you and I always use that same analogy about, the baseball hit into deep field, into the right, left field, and the center, and you got two players that both look up at the ball, and then the ball drops in between them. But I think this is an important issue that needs to have some sense of focus, some sense of accountability around one individual, one position, so that you can get the kind of information that you need in order to see if, in fact, things are working, as opposed to how it's spreading it out, how spread out we have it now, where everybody's hiding behind, well, it's not my job to do, or I've never done that, or things like that. So, again, I look forward to eagerly to hear what you come up with.
Okay.
Commissioner Campos?
A couple of little questions and then one comment. On section 3, page 11, it's a small amount. The Greater Rochester Health Foundation money, it's $817,000 that was grants, and it says that we're not getting any others. Are those just, we haven't received any kind of notification for the mini grants and those types of things? Because I know the Greater Rochester Foundation is giving us a lot of grants based on our wellness policy and implementing it.
Excuse me. Yes, Commissioner. All the Greater Rochester Health Foundation grants are competitive, and they come up throughout the year. It's just at the current time.
It's off.
Right. We don't have anything in the stream right now. But I would imagine as we go through into the spring and into next year that we'll see a number of grants come forward, and then they would be added to the budget when they were granted.
Okay, I just wanted to verify. And then one of the things on section 3, page 13, what I saw when I was looking at the breakdown of Title I and looking at, when we look at English language learners initiatives, you look at if they get $126,000, and then you look at Title III, and it's all salaries, right? Which you need people in order to train, in order to be able to educate our kids. It's just, I look at it, 550, that's $650,000 for a district that, and this is for all, these are for immigrant students, people from Puerto Rico, people from Burma. Though it just seems like we are doing a disservice to our bilingual and SIFE and our immigrant kids. We're doing a great job in terms of RIA. And one of the things, and I'd like to see replicated, because RIA is specifically for immigrant students that are non-Spanish speaking. What is it that we're doing? I mean, we were just at Monroe at the leadership meeting, Van was there, and Armando said, yeah, I've got 5 new students that are coming from an airplane that I know that are gonna be landing in on Monday, right? So what is it, I'd like to see, yeah, in April, exactly. I'd like to see a newcomer program within the district for our Spanish-speaking students, especially going to what, parlaying off of Commissioner Cruz's comments, especially with the tensions between those that are just coming from either the island, one of the islands, or from Central America or South America, or as well as the kids that were born and bred here, the issues that are happening. I'm just curious if that's something that would be doable, right? Where you have that, where they have that immersion program that's focused on, you know, them being acclimated first. If, I don't know, if that's something that's important that we haven't done, and we're doing a disservice to our kids.
I have a request
Please.
for a follow-on question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we do have a pattern for that. If you remember in some emails that I sent, I was just over to the Rochester International Academy.
Yep.
So we do have a model
That's
for that kind of programming. And I would recommend Commissioner Campos and you and Commissioner Cruz to go and take a look at that program over there. They're doing some great work over there. So that may give you some more ideas in terms of how to develop that model. They're doing a great job over there, so.
Exactly.
Wonderful job.
Yeah.
Those kids are so enthusiastic.
Right,
about learning. It's
right,
amazing.
right. You have, let me just point out, you have great leadership over there. So that makes a huge difference over there. But, you know, if we want some example of how to integrate foreign students, that may be a place where you go and make some observations.
That's great. Thank you.
Let me just say that, yes, it is a great model, but let me remind the board and ourselves that, and we do have some Latino students. For example, I met a student that came from Guatemala, but the program is designed, and I think Commissioner Cruz, and we can certainly, the board could, and I invite you to have it, to bring here before a committee so that they will talk to you about the mission, and also we can engage the state education department around this, because there might be some implication here that we need to consider, and that is that model is for children that have not have some of them prior instruction or prior education. Like, for example, I met a child, a child soldier, and also a kid that had lived in a refugee camp for a very long time. So I think it's a good question, and we need to be open to it, but we just need to be careful about what we design, because it will have serious implication. You could, within the resources that we have within the bilingual program, you can create an intensive model or something like, for example, School Number 9 is proposing that is in a grant, that we are open to do that beginning next year, School Number 9. But what they have is more a transitional type of program for a kid, for example, who just arrived in April in here, and goes into a classroom where the culture and the kid and it's the classroom teachers working at a different level. That is more a transitional model that they call it a newcomer, and the folks from the School Number 9 are in the forefront about how do they respond to the needs of the population that Commissioner Cruz is describing. So I think that we had to have a large discussion. And also for next year, we are committed to make sure that the model that the School Number 9 is proposing for the newcomer, they call it the newcomer model, is implemented, but it will have to be with certain variation, not just the similar to the REA program.
So here's my question, then it's only for one school, right? What happens to your secondary school students, and what happens to the rest of our elementary school students? Do they have that opportunity for a newcomer program?
Well, that's a good question. The question that I'm saying is, who is it for? Because you have to decide, what do you want to do for that group of kids? First, decide who they are. Because they are kids that, if you are in 7th grade in Puerto Rico, and you have attend school daily, and are in a good, have received a strong instruction, and you show up in Rochester, New York, let's say in February, an assessment, a well-thought-out assessment that we have an obligation. We have to screen those students, and if they are, and then according to state regulation, and this is what I say, we can just say, by the way, we're going to offer you something different that doesn't fall within the expectation and regulation of the commissioner. So that is different than if you have a program like REAR, kid coming from a refugee camp, where all over the world, we incredible challenge. Again, it's a different population, and I think that the people from REAR, who are expert and wonderful, it would be great to have that discussion, and also engage state education department for guidance in terms if you develop a program. The one school number 9 that we're talking about could easily be replicated in some places if a need were to arise. For example, school 35 might not be receiving the same population as school number 9, let's say, because of the traditional, when family comes here, sometimes they have attachment because they heard in the neighborhood that is school number 9. And today, for example, here's how complicated it is. I met a child from the Central Republic of Congo who came here the child was being recommended by our placement center to go to REAR. The family say no, because I want my child to be with her sister, which is a policy that we wanted to put sibling in the same school. That family insisted, and we are doing the best we can, and we should be proud to provide some kind of support, but you couldn't run in that particular building because of the number of students. Before you were out, I said, Commissioner Campus, that I want to do everything I can that if you introduce a program, it's sustainable. That Rochester cannot afford to bring program after program and then send them go away. For example, sadly, we used to have an Office of Hispanic Study. We no longer have it, right? So I assume that it was for budget reason, not because we don't need them. So that we had to be, I would love to have in every school, let's say, a model that responds to the transitional need, but we're going to have to organize ourselves in a way that we can sustain whatever it is that we do.
I just say all of these things because if you want to impact the graduation rate, our kids have the lowest region scores, even behind special ed. We're not getting it right. And so the REA students adjust and do much better when they go into the school than our students do. So yes, there has to be some kind of differences, some kind of different ways of doing things because we are dealing with a different population. But what we're doing is not working. And so if REA is spoken about by Commissioner Elliott as well, and from many people, if that's working and we're seeing the results, why aren't we looking for what can we replicate in order to work for our Latino students, because it's not getting better.
I just would stop at that because I think we need a better discussion, but when Part 54 of the Commission on Regulation is very prescribing how you deal with incoming population and what you have to organize, and that's, if you want to create like a program of that nature, we have to see what the implication and what adjustment you have to put to Part 154 of the Commissioner Regulation, and it's a discussion that I could not say to this board, let's just do this, and it's something that we had to be very careful. For example, the bilingual program, that will alter significantly what I hear from the community, that they want a bilingual dual language model. That's not what you have at REAR. At REAR is an English immersion, strong, and by the way, the Board of Education could make that shift. But I say, if you want to make that shift, we better have a discussion even outside the budget process, which I think is excellent and is worth having.
And I think it's vital that we have this conversation, because even as our overall population is shrinking with the competition of charter schools and the birth rate, the population of English language learners, formerly interrupted education, a refugee population is growing as a percentage and as in raw numbers. So it's becoming a larger percentage of our overall population. Malik, it's your turn to ask a question, and I'm going to ask if you would. I have to leave for 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay.
If you could
Continue.
charge
I
in
will.
my absence.
I will, in your stead, Commissioner. I can. I just have an overall thing. I mean, I've been off and on. When I was before I was president of the board, I served on the finance committee. I'm back on the finance committee, and so it's not really related. It's related actually overall to sections 1, 2, and 3, but overall to the overall budget proposal. You know, this district got in trouble a long time ago for having financial mismanagement issues before any single person on this board was here. Wasn't a single person that was on the board when that happened. And so I just want to say that I'm very pleased at the financial stewardship that we've been having over the last couple of years, and I hope that can continue. But in looking through this budget, one thing, and I don't need to answer it tonight, but one of the things I saw in this budget that is very concerning to me is merging budget, and I could be wrong here, merging the budget director and the grants job into one. And I could be wrong, but if my read on that is correct, as we go throughout these deliberations, I need to know the rationale for that. I just do not think that function should be merged. Budget should be budget. Grant should be grant. We need a budget person to be focused on the budget, period. Because this is almost $1 billion budget, and I don't want anybody being distracted by having to worry about grant reporting, grant, and all these other things. It just shouldn't be. And I'm speaking from serving a bunch of nonprofit boards too. You need a dedicated bean counter, bookkeeper, whatever you want to call it. Seriously, I mean, and I've seen it. I've seen it, and I was on the first nonprofit board I was on. I won't say the name of it. It doesn't even exist anymore. 1994, I was a youth representative on this 20 years ago. And this organization they merged with another organization, they're still there. But they got in trouble because of, started changing stuff in the finance department, started switching things around. We got stability there now. So I think that overall, as we move forward with things, the things that we do extremely well, I kind of want to stick with that. I don't want to deviate away too much from our budget processes, because in my experience, it served me well on the board. I've had to worry about academic stuff. I've had to worry about all the other things that we're dealing with, but I haven't had to worry so much about the finances. It's the one thing that should keep everyone up on the board at night, but I've been able to sleep a little bit easier because things have been stable. We've had balanced budgets. We've had decent fund balances. So when I saw that in the budget, I was a little... It raised alarm bells for me, and I'll tell you, as we go forward throughout the budget, that's something that I may talk to my colleagues about and advocate for, not doing, but unless there's a good explanation for it. So I don't need an answer tonight on that. Ms. Flanagan, that could even be in writing, but I didn't get a chance to ask the superintendent this, and usually I try to ask him questions before I bring them up publicly. But I really want to know whose idea that was and why, because it's different. And it could be a good reason for it, but it's just something that raises a little bit of alarm bells for me as I put on my finance. Oh, if you wanted to respond, you could.
Yeah, Bill.
I'll provide an answer in writing, given the, how you feel about it. But I want to be direct about it. Who proposed this was me.
Okay.
Proposed this because I believe in accountability.
Right.
So,
Well, I like hearing the person, because I always like to know who proposed. So it's good to know it was you. So perhaps I can have a conversation even offline with you and the superintendent on why that is. But for my colleagues,
That'd be great.
To you all and my colleagues, I just want you to know that that's a concern, because
We will have that commission.
we got to make sure that we keep this stewardship going. We know that we have crazy things coming up on the horizon. We need a dedicated person to stay focused on this money. And I'll continue with Commissioner, until Commissioner Powell comes back. Our representative, parent representative, sections 1 through 3, we're going through. Do you have questions on that area?
We're just doing section 1 for right now.
Section 1, are we still in section 1? Okay, section 1, go ahead.
Section 1, I think we're across all 3.
Oh, we're across all 3, we're doing all 3. So go ahead. Sections 1 through 2.
It's 1.
Yeah, I thought it was just one.
Yeah.
Oh, we just, okay. Section
I
1.
got a section 3 question, so I'll pass for now.
You'll pass it out? Okay, anything else on section 1? Or just, Commissioner Elliott?
Yeah, I just had some small questions on section 1. How much money are we paying for consulting services for this nationally recognized football consultant who has local ties? I haven't gotten that far in the budget yet, so how much money are we paying that person?
Let me provide the breakout of that because I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it's part of that athletic initiative where we break out a chunk of it's for equipment and another substantial piece of it is for paying for our volunteer coaches to actually get trained and certified. It's a roadblock right now where we expect volunteers to step forward, but it costs them money to participate in the process to become actually eligible to coach. So I'll give you a breakout of that whole initiative.
Can we say who that person is at this point? The nationally recognized football consultant who has local ties? The only reason why we held off on that, the mayor is also pursuing private monies to target a particular group that's at risk during the summer, and there was a discussion around possibly doing something jointly around this. So that's why we held off on any discussion, beyond what's in the book at this time. All right. So, and the last question I have is, discuss the net of other changes at 5.2 million. What's included in that total?
What page?
Page 15 of section
1. We can give you a breakout. I mean, literally, when you're talking about $760 million, you try to explain the ups and downs. I was just trying to get sort of like the high level substantive things, and sort of my threshold was, to the extent that things deviated from our projections, some of the actions we took. If it was less than $1 million, I tried to not call it out, because once you slice the pie so small, then it becomes cluttered. So that's the only reason why I stopped at that threshold.
I probably wouldn't have asked the question if it was like 200,000, but.
Yeah, no, it was, I wish it was smaller, but it literally was a cluster of about a number of $500,000 and $100,000 items.
Send those.
So we'll provide a further detail of that.
All right, thank you.
And Ms. Flanagan, you captured that, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. President?
Yep.
Section 1.
Section 1, page 8, deals with expanded learning. And I had asked 2 related questions on paper. One was, please provide key performance measures for each vendor that has a contract with the district of $25,000 or more. Please indicate whether central office has concluded the vendor has delivered on contractual promises. That's page 1 of our responses. And then on page 17, which is an additional question about expanded learning, consistent with section 1, page 8 in the booklet. And on page 17 of the questions and responses, it says, expanded learning, when will the board be able to review comprehensive school level analyses for expanded learning effectiveness. Now, these two questions are actually interrelated. My colleagues have heard me say in the past for many years, I am constantly amazed and simultaneously disappointed that this institution doesn't often justify its budgetary allocations by work product or by whether the contractor or the internal entity has produced some results. This is tragically this district's history. And often decisions are made on funding, whether the funding, decisions are made with respect to programs, are made with respect to whether the funding stream is dried up. For example, when the grant application ends, the program ends without any consideration with respect to whether the program had value or not. Additionally, I've also observed that before programs begin, there is no benchmark, there is no noting where you were, there's often no before and after assessment. And I can see in the question to the answer to the key performance measures that it appears that the district is now saying, I mean, if you look at that answer, it's basically saying we haven't really been doing it, which is, you know, and when I say we haven't, this goes back many, many administrations, long before you got here, Paul. But sadly, the tradition continues. We spend this money, we don't bother to mark where we were, we don't do any analysis afterwards, and we're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars. And it's not only private vendors that are getting the benefit of this non-analysis, but it's internally. Again, we spent millions of dollars on expanded learning. Conceptually, I get it, and I'm with you, Bohan, on the need for expanded learning. But anecdotally, I have heard on occasion that that's not going, and it's not widespread, but I've heard some people say, well, the kids aren't really learning much when they're in these classes. They're not credit bearing, so these kids are leaving. I've heard those stories anecdotally. I don't think it's systemic. But to counteract that, when I'm asked, what's the value of extended learning, there's no data. And when I ask a question, I get, well, we're basically, essentially what I get is, we're gonna do it. Again, let me emphasize, this is after decades, and we're spending millions of dollars. So I am told by reading the response to that question on page 17, that we got all these people, Synergy, New York University, National Center for Time and Learning, Rochester Area Community Foundation, are all gonna, and the Office of Innovation, are gonna give us some data in April. And my question is twofold, it doesn't need to be responded to right now, is expanded learning has been going on for at least, give me the quick answer, how long have we been doing it?
It's about 7 months. This school year is when we first introduced the expanded learning. The New York State Education Department is now requiring from priority school to do extended learning, which is mean we had to add 200 hours to priority school. The reason, and I thank you, great question, and is the right direction that the board need to take and the administration, and that is to measure and evaluate. And I thank you for the nature of your question. Today is the first time that we're going to have hardcore data around about those schools that I use in the expanded learning model, which is there are 5 schools, School 3, which you've been there, and I think that by all accounts, things going well. School 10, which again we have experienced bump, and anyone will tell you that when you start to do something the first year is an implementation year and that you learn from it. But nevertheless, that doesn't excuse us to say we're not going to give you the data. The data, the most important data that the district is being measured by, and when many parents look at, is how are they doing in the academic skill? And that's something that would be common to you. So School 23, for example, we just, on Sunday paper, there were teachers saying, basically anecdotal information, like you're saying, you know, my God, a student now for the first time, I go into the museum, I go into the memorial art galleries, and they saying we need to do more of that, and you hear that. School 45, is on School 46. Those are your 5 schools. And in addition to that, we will give you information around the priority school where we have added 200 hours. School number 9, I'm sorry, I neglected to mention that as well. School number 9, the first year is now in the second year. The school number 9, you have heard me repeatedly telling you that they had one of the best growth score in the district, particularly for the challenges that they are facing. So the first year data in terms of attendance improve, the teacher qualitative analysis was that it was better, and they decided to go voluntarily for the second year. So your question is excellent. I look forward to actually, as you know, and then I will stop, the time to do this. We did change the day that we are going to give the state of our school. And in the state of our school, I will urge you, just like people have been asking me, how many schools might be in a situation like East? We are going to be able to put that transparency and giving you some of that information this hopefully August. And I say hopefully because we need to receive information from the state Ed Department to give the type of update that I think you're calling for.
Commissioner Evans, just a couple quick follow-up questions and quick answers. I notice you use, and if people aren't listening, perhaps they're not getting the distinction, but you talk of extended learning versus expanded learning.
Yep.
I think people ought to appreciate and understand the difference. And then the other thing that, the question I have is, when we introduced that Wegmans concept, that was at least 2 years ago, or maybe...
Yeah, that was last year.
Was that last year?
It was approved in the spring, like 2 years ago, but it was implemented.
When was it implemented? Because I remember there being some conversation about, well, the Wegmans didn't have the staff
Correct.
to support it. So when was that?
That was in the year 2012, 2013.
2012. I thought it was 2012. I didn't recall it was
2012, 2013.
Right. So the question is, for example, how did it work at Northeast Northwest Prep? What was the data? What were the ELA, math scores, graduation rate, attendance rates? How did that work? What were the results? Let me just finish this, and I promise I'll be done, Commissioner Evans. The other issue for me is, I just see historically, and again, this predates your being here. You talk about best practices and worst practices. We have institutionalized this practice of not monitoring and managing what we do. It's terrible. And again, this is not an indictment against you. This is just, it's pervasive. I remember asking for budgets that asked where our performance indicators were, right? And that seems to have sort of gone by the wayside. But here's where I'm going with this. And I sort of mentioned this to Mr. Lopez this morning. I believe the board ought to enact a policy that requires that no money be given out, or we are not, that as part of the contract, that contractors, vendors, have to either provide some assessment, and maybe they write that into their cost, or we give an assessment, but one way or another, because I do not see over the last decade any consistent pattern of evaluating what we do, assessing what we do, and how we spend taxpayer dollars. I think, quite frankly, the board ought to have a policy that says we don't give any money unless it's connected to an assessment. Because there's just not, I don't have the confidence that we will do this.
Those are great questions. I think, again, that we need to do a better job, and I promise you that we will get there. But let me just give a clarification about, because it's an important question, and one in which I have said that we need to bring stability to the district, but there are challenges that we face. And let's say, for example, East. If everybody's saying that we have the Arctics program at East, which just started about 3 years ago. That program is great, yet we got a letter from the state that said, basically, as you know, I don't need to repeat what it said. So, and the same thing happened in Northeast, Northwest. We started on at a sense of urgency that I have been talking about. And we went in, and then the state Education Department placed that school as a priority school, which asked us to redesign this school. Not just one, but the two schools, northeast, northwest, and also both of the school in that campus. So there were outside forces that were in the work that we needed to respond to. As far as the expanded learning, that is a national recognized model by the National Time Collaborative that we got a grant from the Ford Foundation, and that's how, that means that you add in 300 hours or more. They have to, it's voluntarily. The school don't have to participate. The extended learning, the state education department for priority school require that we add 200 hours. And we must. We don't have a choice. The school community doesn't have a choice. The district doesn't have a choice. We have to implement that. The model that I'm talking about that I think the district is considering, and if the data come back that suggests that that's a model worth sustaining, and I think that the data will show that from what I seen in school number 3, you and I were there. This morning, for example, I have all the schools that are asking for the expanded learning model. Right now we have 5 that voluntarily have come in because they want to prevent getting into a situation where they end up as a priority school. One wonderful things that I see here today, I met with the principal and the staff at School 42, and they say, we want to do more for our students. We want to make sure that our students are reading and getting the support that they need. And they clearly say, today we don't have enough time to do as much as we want to do for our kids. But again, your question is the right one. After this year, where are we versus all the school? And my commitment is that once we receive that data from the state, and attendance and suspension and everything, and parental engagement and all the factors, that we come back to you as part of the state or school and report that, whatever the data might be.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Adams, Section 1.
Just following up on the same area, is there not data and analytic capacity within the department, within the innovation office, the Office of Innovation, to do, real-time monitoring and evaluation based on our metrics? I mean, we have a very, very powerful data analytics system, technology-wise. We have competent analysts. So it seems like it should be reasonable that the district itself, the Office of Innovation and related staff, would have, in addition to all of the other evaluations that are connected to specific grants and the school improvement grant program and so on, would have an evaluation plan and monitoring plan, no?
We do that. The monitoring is going on. Like, you participate in what I consider one of the initiatives that I commend the board for reinforcing that monitor. President White was with me at School 3, and we go to School 34, and you sort of right there, whether we agree or not, by the way, including attendance, you see that at the hall at school, where they are monitoring the progress, and you heard it from that principal. Whether we're saying, I also caution the board in this community, because the community is judging us by graduation rate and how a student do in English language, art, and math, that year to year, the community gets a report. And I guess my response is, yes, you do formative assessment and summative assessment, and we have that, and we are doing that. And I do believe that, once again, the direction of the board, that we go into the building and continue to do that, that's part of strengthening that, which is what I think is the desire of the board. So for example, you can go right now and ask us how our school doing in terms of attendance. And you can go in and ask how are they expected to do in this year assessment system that we just, that I taken place this week.
I was just, I mean, you don't have to respond, but I was talking more comparative analysis, like comparison across schools that have expanded learning versus those that don't, or time analysis before and after, but that's okay. One question I had was, it's doable. Yes, they can. They absolutely can.
Tell you they can.
Yes, you can.
Oh, all right. Yes, you can.
Absolutely.
can.
I have faith.
Yes, we
I have
can.
faith. I know people here can do that.
Yes, we can.
Everything is
So
possible.
I had one specific question in follow-up to the restructuring of early childhood education and literacy. You described a unit that would be responsible for pre-K through 3, that would be well-staffed, it would be multi-program coordination. Is that structure, those staffing, like a mini organizational chart available in this budget?
It is not in here, but we could provide that to you.
Okay, that would be great. With, of course, the early childhood director restored to pre-K. It would be great to see that, to see that structure alongside a fully restored early childhood director. I'm serious. I really think that it's fair for that to be drafted, even if there's not a commitment tonight. I think there's a strong enough sense that that is a reasonable request. And then in terms of the expanded learning cost, there's a section that says more, and this is in section 1, page 7, more and better learning, 5.9 million additional funding. But then the discussion within it includes much more than $5 million. So there's, and maybe this is the distinction between what's not considered new funding versus what's considered ongoing sources of revenue versus new, or new spending, I should say, rather than revenue. So it says the proposed budget includes $3 million for 5 additional expanded schools, and then $13 million in total for expanded learning schedules at 9 schools, and optional extended learning time at 7 schools.
Yeah, the 13 was total, the 5.9 was intended to be incremental.
So 13 million is the price tag for all expanded learning programs and extended schedules, inclusive of SIG required or priority school requirements? Or is it bigger than that? Or is that for later?
I'll give you a complete listing of how that details out.
Okay.
And tie it right back.
Thanks. And then one last question in this section. In terms of, so we have significant special education restructuring, and there's also a mention of alternative program restructuring, and then of course there's the elimination of in-school suspension rooms for K through 6 schools. So this is going to be a big area of attention for me. In terms of the social worker role, is there a new role for social workers within special education reorganization?
You want to answer? You want to answer the question? You want to come in?
Is there any change in the role of school-based, and in particular, at this point, just elementary school is good enough. Social worker.
Sit in here, please? That way everybody can hear the whole world.
So is there a role for social workers, school-based elementary social workers in particular, in restructuring of special education? Is there any different, like more reliance, less reliance, the same as their role is now?
Well, we're looking at adding, at a minimum 1 social worker per building, which would be responsible for both the provision of mandated services per an IEP, counseling, as well as offering social and emotional supports for the building. In conjunction with the psychologist, and in some buildings, the guidance counselor would work together in a social emotional learning framework.
So are we getting guidance counselors in elementary?
No, at some buildings, so at the secondary buildings, where there are guidance counselors.
My concern is that we're eliminating in-school suspension rooms. We're not seeing in this budget, as of now, any restoration of alternative to suspension. And we're seeing restructuring of special education at the same time that we're seeing more elimination of behavioral supports in general. And so the question is adding one social worker per building, which sounds great, and it is a response, I think, to community desire for social workers. I'm just concerned that it may not be actually a net gain in social and emotional supports. That's where I'm coming from with this concern.
When the superintendent comes back, he'll respond to that. I'm sorry, I thought I brought Chris up around just the special education piece. He just had to go to the men's room.
Put
you
all his business in the street.
essentially you'd see it as the same role. With restructured special education, you'd see the role of the social worker in an elementary building as essentially the same, not more demands than prior to restructuring, and not necessarily less demands than prior to restructuring.
I would actually see the social worker having more of a proactive role as opposed to now where they spend a majority of the time providing mandated special education services per an IEP. They would have an increased role in that proactive piece of social emotional learning. So it would be, I think, a significant shift in their role in a building.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Commissioner Powell is back, and I tip the chair back to her.
Well, thank you so much for marshaling that for me in my absence. My understanding is everyone has had a chance to air their questions for Section 1, and that we may proceed to Section 2 at this time. The heading for Section 2, Policies, Priorities, and Plans, much of which you've already articulated to some extent the board's priorities and ideas for plans. Commissioner Cruz, would you like to kick us off once again? You're not going to ever sit in that seat again, are you?
I've caused enough trouble today, so I'm good for the evening.
No, I just wanted to say again and repeat what I said when you presented this. I think this is exactly what we were looking for as a board, and you did a great job of articulating it last week. And looking through it, it seems, it's the not, I don't want to say the common, it's the simpler approach that's difficult to do, right? So it's just being able to stay steadfast with the simpler approach as opposed to going much more complex. So I just really appreciated this, and thank you.
Oh, I guess Malik is passing. He's excellent. Would you like a question? You've had as much as you can take tonight. All right. Yeah. GC, what is your question? Do you have
both questions I have are more related to Section 3, so I'll hold off until
so you'll
we get
pass?
to that.
All right. Well, I'll take my turn and express publicly and formally what I've already tried to hint at. One of my personal hopes for this budget year is that it is in keeping with board policy on daycare in our schools, which had been abandoned for at least 14, 15 years, and yet the policy still stands. It's my hope that we could restore daycare in our Young Mothers program only, and that there are ways of achieving that goal that could be close to cost neutral, on the assumption that each of our young mothers is in all likelihood eligible for county daycare subsidies. If we are able to tap into the county Child Care Council to get an approved child care provider, we should be able to make an initial investment and then call upon our various agencies, volunteers like the YWCA and the county to help those young people get appropriately certified to be eligible for that child care, so that before the year is out, though that outlay might be cost neutral. So that I wanted to get that out there as one of, not only one of my priorities, since I wasn't able to articulate it earlier, but also to remind the administration that the policy is still out there, and the fact that everyone has essentially turned away and ignored that policy for all these years doesn't excuse it. With that statement, I will pass to the next.
Here's my concern, and we're on policies, priorities, and plans. We're good at putting this stuff together. The problem is in the accountability and in the implementation. And so it doesn't matter what new program comes out. It doesn't matter even on the state level. There's something fundamentally that we're not doing in this district that we are ignoring, that somehow we don't think can work. And until we understand what is fundamentally going on within this district, we're going to continue to have charter schools come in. We're going to continually have the state asking us to redesign what we do. We've got to figure out on a very systemic level, to the root cause, what's going on in our district. And until we figure that out, I don't care what we put in place here, if we don't get the underlying issues addressed, and then understand what those issues are and design systems and put the right people in place around them, this is just an exercise in futility. It's not the money. I don't care how much money you get. It's not the money, but until we figure it out, what the issues are in our community and design programs around that. Now, if there's some barriers around state legislation or some other legislation, then we need to go and talk on the state level about those kinds of things that are preventing us from educating our children. This is a district of primarily African-American students. Latinos are second. And so if we're not addressing those issues from a cultural standpoint and designing programs around a cultural standpoint, then this is not going to work. There was just a study that came out, if you got the latest edition of On Board, they speak to a University of Albany study that speaks about some work that they've done to be able to graduate at-risk students on time. Now there, from what I can see from and they also include East Irondequoit in that study, however, albeit a little different than what in terms of demographics. But the issue is that we got to be able to understand what's going on with our children, understanding that there's a lot of trauma that goes on in our families. You know, how do we really relate to our families? We got to get the right people in those positions who are able to bring resolution to those. We've got educated people around here, but we really don't have the people that understands what's going on in the urban environment, unfortunately. We understand it from a theoretical level, but we're not getting to the core. And so we really are going to have those kinds of conversations. And it is at that point that we can really develop our budget. But until we figure out what the real issue is, this is just one year after another year, because I'm going into the school profiles, and every one of them are below 50% in terms of ELA and math scores. Even one of your highest schools, like Soda, for example, some of those scores are 28% or 46%. Nothing beyond, from what I could tell, beyond 50%. So we've got all this money, but somehow it doesn't seem to be able to work. So next year, what I'm expecting is that I'm going to see great improvements in these ELA and math scores and graduation rates. But I don't. This is just 1 year. We're doing the same thing, and in my mind, it's an exercise of futility. Thank you.
Trying to figure out where the budget question was in that, but go ahead.
Well, we were talking about plans and priorities, so in this section 2, and so there wasn't necessarily any budgetary information in here, but it was in terms of how we're going to proceed. So that's what my question relates to.
Bill and I are meeting tomorrow regarding the additional questions that you all saw were 3 hours late on Friday. I think it was when the questions were due, and I apologize for that. But I had submitted prior questions, and then I had some additional questions, and additional questions were surrounding the special committees that the board impaneled. And those committees' solutions actually reflect where they think the district ought to be in terms of policies, priorities, and plans. So while there are questions that, for example, one says, how much does it cost to hire an African-American? What was the cost? What is the salary of the director of African-American Studies? That's not a question about African-American Studies. That's a question about what the committees believe should be a priority. And it's a veiled question about the Latino Studies Department, which Commissioner Cruz spoke of earlier on. So, Bill, when we talk about that tomorrow, that question doesn't relate at all to African-American studies. It relates to a priority that I believe, and many people in this community believe, including people on the special committee, including Commissioner Cruz and other people, I'm sure, that we ought to have as a priority focusing on our efforts on Latino students who are struggling, and they are a disproportionate share of our students. So I sort of look at this as not a nice phrase, alliteration, I think is what my daughter calls it. Policies, priorities, and plans. It sounds good, but it has to have meaning. So if you look at those additional questions, colleagues, they relate to those special committee issues. There's questions about parent liaisons, because one of the priorities of this community, one of the policies that they'd like to see changes, they want to see the Office of Parent Engagement elevated to another level so that it reports to the board. So I asked questions about where that's going. So if you all look at those questions, those late questions, and they, as Deborah put them at the end because they were late, those special committees are making recommendations about policies, about practices that they think, I mean, the Office of Social Justice, that was a recommendation of this committee. That's about policy. They want equity, they want fairness, and they believe that there's an office that could make that happen. Now, I somewhat dispute that, and people ought to understand, these were not my ideas. These were ideas from committees impaneled by the board. Many of the people that served on these special committees were designated by board members. These are community ideas. And I think if they don't say anything else, they say what they think the priorities of this district ought to be. And I could summarize it very quickly. They believe that the priorities ought to be parents. And for whatever reason, I'm not the person who came up with that idea. They believe that making the Office of Parent Engagement report to the Board of Education will reflect a practice and a policy that makes parents #1 priority, if you want another alliteration, right? That's what they're saying. So please look at those questions, because I think they do reflect some significant policy changes that the community is suggesting, and reasonable ones. And so tomorrow, Bill and I will talk about what is this salary range for an assistant director within the district. That's a veiled question that relates to one of the policy changes that came out of those committees. Please describe the composition, staff budget division of the Office of Accountability. There was a question there, there was a proposal about creating an office. What did they call it, JC, do you know? It was called, or there was an office that was similar to the Office of Accountability.
Office of Social Justice?
No, it wasn't social justice, it was another one. But again, they were valuing the importance of innovation. And my thought was, we already have that. Another question, please describe the pencil partnerships that are currently in existence, and I'll also identify the department that is responsible for managing them. there was a recommendation that they do an adopt-a-school program. Well, the reality is, I think, we'd be reinventing the wheel, because we already have significant partnerships that relate to schools. But again, I would ask my colleagues to look at those questions not as regular budget questions, but I'm telling you, what those committees came up with, those recommendations, by and large, they were about what the community believes in terms of policy. The two biggest ones there's actually probably three. One is the Latino Studies Department. I think that's huge. That reflects what they believe to be an accurately, I believe it's an accurate policy shift for this district to recognize that there are distinct issues relating to Latino students. I think another policy statement is we want to elevate the role of parents. And another policy statement that can be accomplished through this budget is we want an Office of Equity. You know, and I'll give you an example. Today, we talked about the fact that every school ought to have a social worker. I think that's, as Mary said, Commissioner Adams said, that's a great idea. But every school having a social worker is a conversation about equality. There's another policy issue. It's called equity, right? Maybe every school doesn't need a social worker. Now, I'm not belittling this idea. It's the right thing to do. I think Commissioner Adams is right. This is maybe in response to you listening to the community, and you probably figured that out on your own, that we do need more social workers. But the policy statement here is making sure the schools that need them have ample enough social workers and behavioral support systems to make those schools right. That's the policy question. So when we say, and again, I want to be respectful, I'm not denigrating this notion of making sure, because I have a lot of friends who are social workers who would kill me if they thought I was being critical of what you're trying to do there. But that's not the policy statement. The policy statement has to be, we want behavioral support systems in place, including social workers, that are directed in such a way is to meet the needs of schools that really need them. And one social worker at, let's say, number 9 school, or take your choice, is not going to do it. That's not the policy statement that I think this board wants to make. So I want to say to my colleagues, I think we have a lot more work to do here. And that it would be too easy to say, oh yeah, he's done a good thing, and you have. Asking for a social worker in every school, like a car in every driveway, chicken in every spot. It's bigger than that, because some people need more than one car. Some people need more than just chicken stew. And I'm saying we may have to make some difficult decisions as a board about, okay, we like your idea of one social worker in every school, but we may need to make some decisions to take away social workers from schools that don't need them, or we may need to just really bite the bullet and buy 2 and 3 cars at schools that really need them. Otherwise, you know, your assessment was, you said something like, oh, it's a waste of time, or I don't know what your last name was. It's very discouraging. I can't remember exactly what you said, but I would agree with her if we just had one social worker for every school. That, to be honest, I don't mean to be ungrateful, but that's not going to do it. But you can get people more encouraged about a policy statement that says we're going to make sure that schools have the behavioral support systems that they need, including social workers.
Mary?
Did he have a budget question in there?
No, I did not.
Thank you.
I did. I'll answer the question. I did not.
Can I just, Commissioner, I just want to,
I'm trying to keep it so we're not here until 11 o'clock at night.
the responses to questions 53 through 73 were sent to the board about 5:59, so they should be in Deb's email now.
We have them in front of us.
Oh, great, okay. So
I'm not going to ask a question either. I'm just going to tie things together here. No, Vice President Elliott, I really agree with what you said.
I'm sorry.
I really agree with what you said, except
It wasn't a budget question, no.
except the part about it being futile, and
That was it. Futile.
immediately following you, President White then reviewed the community input process that was just undertaken, and I think that while he summarized many of the important points, my takeaway from those committees, particularly the one on instructional achievement, whatever the one was on instruction and achievement, was that we actually need more community control in terms of curriculum and if you want to call it behavioral support or building school cultures. So exactly what you're talking about, when we have a community that is majority people of color, majority African American with significant Latino population, that means that the Office of Social Justice that was proposed, the Office of Instructional Innovation that was proposed, which was a different vision from the Office of Innovation that we have now, which is very much federal and state reform agenda driven. That was a very different image of that, you know, tied in with deep parent and student involvement. That's the vision. That's the vision. That's the solution. And we have a process, and that process is fragile. And, you know, I don't know if the administrators in this audience are taking it all that seriously, to be perfectly honest. But it's important that we, as a board, make sure that our administration does take that process seriously, because it actually is where that shift that you so eloquently identified that will, if we don't achieve it, will make everything be futile, that will be where we remain. So thank you for articulating that. Thank you, President White, for putting in motion a very important process. Thank you for Melissa and Jose, commissioners, for, you know, bringing to the table the important parts of, not just from the immediate past month, but I know that there's been serious work done in terms of Latino leadership and identifying problems. So let's work together. Let's work together with the administration to make sure that our community priorities really are articulated. One small point in the action plan that there's really important work going on around discipline and culture. Thank you for working with the Advancement Project, which I think is a really positive resource and a good mechanism. In this, the way that the issues with school discipline are articulated focus on students as having behavioral problems. There's a description of a continuum from violence, street violence, which we know is a huge crisis in our community, down to misbehaviors in the classroom, and the need to enlist community stakeholders and supporters to help address this, because we obviously can't do it alone. But what I would like to really focus us on, and I think the board
This is section 2, page 15. Is that correct?
Page 19. Yep, section 2, page 19. Right.
Sorry.
I would just like to focus us on where the board has been coming from in terms of concerns with excessive suspensions and a real desire to move away from zero tolerance policies and punitive approaches toward much more embracing, you know, the buzzwords of restorative practices and so on. That has to focus on our staff, and that's a cost, could be a low cost, if not cost neutral thing, to really insist that everyone in the school community, and maybe this speaks to your language about treating every child as if they were our own, but putting mechanisms in place as we implement discipline reform to really address school culture and staff behaviors, because it's relational. So much of what happens with escalating situations is relational, and it's not, you know, crisis intervention, trauma-informed approaches, they all are little pieces of the puzzle, but there's a bigger vision that has to have to do with, I mean, you can say treating all of our children as our own, I guess that's a good way to frame it, but there has to be a meaty, like something one layer below that talks about implementation and how we help support staff. We don't beat on them because things have been going on for so long in a crisis way, but we support and we expect. So I would hope that as we go forward with the discipline priorities, that we make sure it's relational and that we have as much expectation for our own institution and the staff inside of all of our schools as we do for our community and for the students.
Commissioner Powell, if I could just say, because this goes to what Commissioner Elliott was saying and your question to her, I think the reason why she framed her answer the way I did and the way Mary did is because of the caption, policies, priorities, and plans. It really does speak to thematically where the district, and by the way, I think actually that's a good thing, because in this conversation about budgets, it's easy to get lost in numbers and forget where generally you want to be. And so I don't recall this ever being in a budget book before, but I actually think this is a very good addition. I realize we can't spend a lot of time talking about it, but maybe we should, you know? So I think it happened this way because somebody decided, I don't know who made the decision to put this in there, but I don't ever recall this being in this budget book before. And I actually think it's a very healthy thing, and I think it ought to be tab 1 rather than tab 2.
Okay. Any other questions on section 2? Is that a yes or a no? That's a no. Okay. Well, I do have one response to one of the late questions, question 57, was a question about the code of conduct of the managed choice policy. And as I skimmed through the answer, I was a little alarmed at the way it was worded. It ends by saying that we will be presented with recommendations on April 15th. So I will check my concern at the door, but the sentence before that is, the next step will be to establish new school boundaries to balance school capacities with students. When we adopted the school choice policy, it was to end the practice of establishing specific school boundaries, and it was done on purpose so that we would never, ever, ever again have to adjust school boundaries based on the ebbs and flows of population, but rather that the capacity of the school and the process of choice would be what drove the enrollment, not the number of students that lived in that community. So I'm just giving you advance notice that I'm worried about what I'm going to hear in 2 weeks, and I'll be following that very carefully. Okay?
Let me, just that you raised the issue, Michael L., I did question him, is preparing a report that I think what you will find is that in his finding was that the policy was put in place but implemented where the type of fidelity that I think we all would like to call for. And finally, in the St. Vicky Ramos came into that, it is his assertion that now the managed choice policy in terms of the selection is being managed as it was proposed to. But what I would like, Commissioner Power, is for Vicky, and perhaps she can give you an update, but also bring over Michael Ells to give us an update to the board and about his findings.
And I don't mean for it to take a long time, because if we're going to have a separate presentation.
No, I think it was probably a sentence that was left out, but actually in errors we copy and pasted. His recommendation was that if we were to look at the school managed choice again and we wanted to incorporate some part of the neighborhood piece, and then we would have to look again at that school boundaries, and you and I have had many conversations about that, because we do have some schools that the neighborhood is big, they wouldn't fit, and then you'd have other schools that are empty. So in no way are we looking to change that. It was just part of his recommendation that if you're trying to do both, and then you really have to relook at what we call home schools. We've never changed anything from what you guys designed years ago.
Thank you.
Okay? Yeah.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions on section 2? Seeing none, hearing none, section 3. Jose?
I'm good.
I already asked mine altogether. I didn't realize we were doing it section by section.
Actually, had a couple questions, so I'll go through the first one and then pass, and we can come back. That'd be great. The expeditionary learning process and program that's in several schools. There's some funding for it in section 3, the little bit of local funding. It's a few $100s. Was looking at that program from the perspective of quite a few parents who are very passionate, very supportive of that program. And I'd like to understand the district strategy going forward around expeditionary learning, and what elements, to what extent that will be implemented within the district. It's currently at 4 schools, various levels of implementation, and I'd like to be able to get some feedback and communicate that to the various parent groups around just how far the district plans to go with this, both in terms of the implementation with Fidelity, as well as the funding that's required to do that.
We have a commitment to do that, but President White asked an interesting question about vendor. Have to be careful that vendor don't dictate what we need to do. And also, I have an obligation to the board and also to the commissioner of the state of New York, that all we agents of the state. As much as I don't like to say that, that's who we are. That in some school, for example, I find out that they were given credit for a class that we're not supposed to. I also have said to this board that whatever we do has to be sustainable. So you cannot have teachers just teaching 4 classes, in particular when you try to expand this to, at one point we used to have a school number 58 only, but as you move forward and you're replicating them, you cannot have a critical mass school, and anyone will tell you that 4 classes are not something sustainable. This district have been in that place, and I don't want to be negative here, but we've been in a place where you have 804 people were being laid off here. And one of the things that I appreciate from the board is that we have been cognizant that we had to be consistent and bring stability to the district. So there is a strong commitment. I've seen some great progress in school number 8, for example. We're using that approach to deal with a school that is a priority school. And one of the requests that the staff in there was making of me is to make sure that they have a coach and make sure that they have the support that they need. And there's a commitment for that. And we will agree to it, but ultimately we have the responsibility for accountability, like President White is saying. What do we mean by that is that we cannot, my accountability to the board, I had to look up not only board policy, but also regulation. And one of the, sometimes of the challenges you find with vendor is that sometimes they could design a program, but they don't have to look from the perspective of scaling them out. Let me repeat, we had a school 58, now we have full school, 4 of them, and we had to be careful in our approach to make sure that we are vendor and our partner, that we got to make sure that our investment is sustainable in those 4 schools, not just one.
Can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yes, please.
Are you doing that on the EL part?
Go ahead.
Just a follow-up question. So what I think I'm hearing is that it's a question of a specific vendor, but not, so moving potentially away from a specific vendor, but continuing an expeditionary learning model. So what would then be the criteria? So, and what I also hear is that the criteria from expeditionary learning with capital E and capital L is that it's too expensive or too constraining, or too, there's something about it that we need to relax in order to, what I'm hearing is replicate into other schools.
No, that's not what you're hearing. What you're hearing is the spirit of accountability. Like, for example, in School 10, where your school was, which you are familiar with, we provided a lot of professional development, invested a lot. And then I asked the question this fall, meeting with people from expeditionary learning, are we seeing in how many of the staff I left? And that's a district-wide challenge that we have, that you train the staff to be an expeditionary learning school, in this case, School 10, and then a number of teachers that were trained and we invested dollars, now they're in the school where that model is not being used. So that's something that is a challenge for me, that I had to ask myself that question when I'm going to invest in PD, that a vendor doesn't necessarily have that accountability process. The other question that I ask is, then there were some teacher that went, actually, I believe, to Boston for the training. And I asked the question, are we seeing a difference in those who received the training and those who didn't? Again, I don't want to get to more specific, but let me just say that there is a commitment, that's what you're saying. This is what I'm saying. There's a commitment to the expeditionary learning partnership. We want to continue that. But we also, if I hear President White carefully, is that we had to constantly be asking ourselves the question. And also, let me just say that we had to departure, and we did, from some practice that you continue to hear. And that doesn't mean that we've given up on the process. It's just that we are not support to award credit for a class that is not recognized as a credit-bearing course for full credit. And I asked, for example, the folks who expeditionary learning, tell me one school in the state of New York that gives a credit for that particular course. Which is, by the way, it's a nice thing. It's the cruise program that they build in community and where they gather in the morning and do wonderful stuff, which has tremendous value, which I'm not saying it doesn't, but just doesn't meet the criteria or a credit-bearing class.
So should it be eliminated?
I didn't say that. I just said that it's a
so
significant activity, but it's not a course that a teacher could say that will account for 1/5 of my class. And if you were to do that, you will not have a sustainable model as we're trying to replicate it throughout the district.
All right, so where I started when I was saying that what I was hearing you say was that EL, capital EL, was constraining in a certain way. Their expectations to be true to their model were constraining, so therefore we should look, from what I hear you saying, to a different implementation of EL. And I'm open to, but what I'm trying to get to is what criteria would you use then if we were not using EL? So if EL requires 4 classes.
They don't require that. That's my point. That it was something that was developed here at School 58. Mm-hmm. They don't require necessarily 4 classes. First of all, they cannot supersede the commissioner regulation. They can say, they don't supersede. It's sort of like, I wish the parents who were arguing with me about arts in this district. I have said constantly that since I've been here, that we provide the least amount of instructional time to our children. Therefore, when you want to do something extra, you even have more pressure, more constraint, versus a district that have a different, that have even 15 minutes extra. So that's a challenge that we are facing in this district in terms of flexibility.
So does partnering with EL limit our flexibility?
Not necessarily limit our flexibility, but let me just say that, and let me just be clear. A vendor cannot come and say to us, this is a course. They don't have that authority to say this is a course. Mm-hmm. Even the Board of Education, as powerful as you are, and as legitimate of a body as you are, can supersede certain regulation of the commission. And when we talk to them, they have been times that there have been that kind of if you will, disagreement or tension. And also within the school community. Last year when we introduced the master schedule, we continue, and Anita, I think that you and I went there, you might want to speak to that, even creating more clarity to what I'm saying about what those tensions were with the master schedule, and also the whole notion of the teacher case law.
So what I'm trying to get at is if being associated with EL gives us the label EL, and if we're going to back away from that because of constraints.
We are not backing away.
I think so. Let me.
That was the rationale that was given for cutting back.
So when you implement EL, as you do the implementation, there's traditionally an EL coach that is in that building during implementation. But after implementation and staff training, the model is, in most places, that the EL coach goes away and the staff assumes that responsibility, right? So I think it's not the EL model that you're backing away from, but it's, you know, you've trained folks, you have those folks that have done that work in that building, and then eventually the vendor part of that drops off and you use them as consultants, those kind of things. So, and it's not the EL model that dictated what the superintendent is saying at a school 58, right? It's the model that was built by the coach, that specific EL coach, and the staff that was then put into place that was at question. There's a lot of EL schools across the country that don't do things like give credit for none, quite honestly, in New York State, because it's not a course that we can actually even report to New York State as a credit-bearing course. So it's not that we're giving up crew at all, but the idea that you accrue credit and it's one of your 5 class periods is something internally, structurally, that we have to fix in order to replicate the EL model in other places so that we can assure we can sustain it. I mean, I think it's that simple. It's not a back away from EL, it's not a back away from the model, but eventually you don't need the vendor anymore to be able to do all the things that they had to do during implementation.
So is there some, I'm sorry, and I'll butt out of your questioning, is there another standard set of, another organization, a nonprofit or an academic resource or something that gives standards so that you know whether something is EL or is not EL according to
EL does
agreed upon standards?
EL does that. I mean, EL does that.
Is there someone other than that vendor? There's no one other than that vendor?
No, there's no. It's like trademark. You can, it's like an IB model. You can do that. But again, what I said to President White is that when we engage with vendor, and this has happened in here, when I'm negotiating with a vendor and I get 20 pressure, so you had to enter into a contract, and we had to be very careful with that. And I answer that question because there's every interest in the part of the administration to continue and replicate the model with fidelity. But I have said to people like I remember when meeting with folks, and in one meeting, at least people were saying, in order for us to have this model, to be an expeditionary school, you had to, teacher only can have 4 courses, case law. And I said, no, you don't have to. There's nothing that say that teacher in a expeditionary learning model only can teach 4 classes. But people in our community and parents, which I understand, were advocating for that. And what I'm saying to this board, if you want something of that nature and you wanted to support that, please understand that in the long run, if you continue to do more and more, it might not be sustainable, and we might find ourselves in a situation in which we had to continue to do what we sometimes had done, that we invest and then had to retreat because we haven't been able to sustain it. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So it sounds like the district will stay committed to the 4 schools that are currently the expeditionary learning schools. I think after the explanation you gave, it would probably be helpful to have a status as to where each of those 4 schools are in the implementation process and what additional funding or support would be needed to get those schools up to the level that you would consider them a sustainable model.
Correct. Good. We will.
Thank you.
Provide. Thank you.
Cynthia?
The BOCES funding, BOCES services, in light of the CET initiative, I would have thought, which is scheduled to begin in the next school year. Well, I'm just talking about the overall CTE program, Mr. Superintendent.
Yep.
So I guess I would have thought that how much is that going to cost us?
By the way, we're on section 3, page 19.
Yeah, how much is it? And because I'm looking at thinking that perhaps that should be what's proposed under BOCES services should be a higher number.
Yeah, we have a new situation right now, Vice President Erlings, that we are required now to provide, our student access to basic career and technical education for East High School. So we are working right now with BOCES 1 and 2 to provide us available seat, and then the cost will be determined right now. We would, let's say if 50 students were to choose, selected to go there and deem appropriate placement for them, that would be a different cost than if it is 25. But Bill could give you an approximate number, and that's one of the challenges that we are facing with East High School. We did put close to, I think, approximately $1 million aside, but the cost for East High School could be greater. And then let me just caution you, the East High School, also, we don't have grant anymore. It's not like we can say, well, we're going to apply for a school improvement grant. This is something that is sort of like we must do with our grant, or that school is subject to the commissioner basically saying to us, you have to do X. Just like the commissioner is saying about BOCES. We don't have a choices today whether we will offer BOCES or not to students at East. We have to make that available, and the price tag is going to be determined by the number of kids that decide to go there.
That's separate from determining what program that we would have over there?
That's we have to offer to the student today. So meaning to start in the year 14, 15.
Okay. Since I'm on the same page, I have quick questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
Oh, okay.
So that particular line, right, with BOCES,
yes,
that also includes our contract with BOCES for nursing services, and we had a strategy that we embarked on, where our expense for nursing services over the last number of years has increased by $1.2 million, and our revenue was frozen. So included in our budget closure plan was asking BOCES to provide a plan to roll that back. At the same time, we embarked on a plan to get the attention of the state legislature about this issue, and within a week we'll know if we were successful in getting a response for that. So if that happened, you would see this line go up by $1.2 million if we got an increase in dedicated revenue for that. I don't want to say more than that at this time, but that's part of what's going on in that line right now. It's on this page.
If I could restate what you just said, this budget was built around an assumption that BOCES would find a way to deliver current services plus the charter schools at the current price, whatever services were needed at the current price tag. But if we find a solution, both revenues and expenses are going to go up.
1.2 million.
And it's important also that, we want to maintain high quality services, of course, for our students.
Can you discuss the proposed $19 million for hourly teachers? What do our hourly teachers do? Is this additional pay, or what's the hourly teachers line? And that's $19 million, $19.5 million.
Section 3 is page 18.
Yes.
The hourly teachers includes any extra pay related to teachers beyond their regular time. So every time you approve a board resolution, that's typically where these dollars reside.
I want that to go to zero.
Well, one of the reasons it's going up is due to many things, such as the growth in the expanded day programs and our summer programs. That's where those dollars are. So even if we would like to go to zero, then we would just get back to our basic 10-month schedule without any extra time. So this is the real driver in that budget line.
And just one last question. Just in terms of, we've had a significant winter. So when we have those costs around winter, I'm sure that that's driven the cost up. Where do we take that money from? Fund balance?
Well, typically, that's one of the reasons why you have a contingency budget. While we, will budget things like utilities on a 3 to 5 year average, as we know, there's no such thing as an average year. So the last 2 years, we were actually below average, and we had additional monies then rolled into the fund balance. This year, we had to dip into that $5 million budget contingency line to support the utilities budget, which exceeded our budget and our long-term projections.
No questions from Commissioner?
Yeah, I'm set on this.
Are you all set? GC? I think there's.
So can I ask one more
No
question?
question. It's down to you two.
Okay, just one last question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Please.
The SIG, there were several grants, I believe these were all federal grants, the SIG, the Race to the Top, and Title I, that from this budget year to next budget year are going to drop a cumulative of about $14 million. With the loss of that funding, what is happening to the staff, the programs that that funding supported? That seems like a relatively good chunk of money, and wanted to understand how the funding would be covered, and what programs, if any, we would lose due to that loss of funding.
That's a great question, and something that we are looking overall. There is a projection that due to the Race to the Top money and SIG, we are going to begin to see a decline. So you are quite correct. So I would like Bill to talk about in terms of what our discussion has been in terms of making adjustment, which you see even in this budget, by the way, we're making some adjustment in staffing. Mm-hmm. So that's what the greater implication would be. And also there are some impact on vendor. A lot of this money, many dollars are being invested on vendor that they come in and they are required as part of the grant. For example, you look at Monroe and we have a agreement with WestEd. We have colleges and universities that get part of this grant. But your question is a very important one, and one that we should provide some update to the board about projection for grant, because it's tied to the challenging that we have. So I'd like Bill to talk a little bit about it.
I'll start, and I'm going to ask Vern to follow up. Deliberately in the executive summary, we tried to highlight a number of grants that were underway, but we weren't at the point where we're ready to reflect them in the budget. They are reflected on page 1-17. So there's a whole list of them there. They're not completely inclusive, but that was our best guess at that time. And so you see a whole list of potential there. There's a total of 17 million, right, that those end, but that we're also applying for another $15 to $25 million in competitive grants. So those applications are either underway or the process is underway. And this is an annual timing issue at this time of year, because you don't know what you don't know, and so you have to reflect that in this budget. So at a high level, that reflects where we are. Let me ask Vern if he could provide any additional clarity.
Getting back specifically to the SIG grants or the school improvement grants, I think it's important to understand that these are competitive 3-year grants. And the purpose, and they're awarded by New York State to, schools that are struggling. And the purpose of the grant is for these schools to assess what they're doing, to determine improvement, help determine and fund improvement plans, to provide professional development, and to transition the school from where it is to where it's going to be. So part of the strategy and all that is we try to minimize staffing, permanent staffing funding in those grants, because we know that when the grants end, it's very difficult to sustain, and the schools will have to get back to what their regular allocations would be. So remember, a lot of these grants, especially with the competitive grants, are they're very temporary, okay? And so part of the plan and part of what we try to do with all these grants is, one, get grant funding that aligns with the district's goals and our strategic plan. Two, know that it's temporary in nature so that when the grant runs its course, the school will have to, part of their planning will be figuring out how to sustain going forward. And three, not create a situation where we ramp up with a lot of additional staff that when it ends, we just eliminate them and they're right back to where they began. So I think we just have to be honest with ourselves and keep in mind that these competitive grants are a two-edged sword, that if we use them appropriately, and that is what's the intent for the grant, it aligns with our goals and our strategies, and we recognize that it's temporary funding that we have to wean ourselves away from, we can use them successfully. If we don't do that, and keep that in mind up front during the implementation of the grant and the aftermath of the grant, we really shouldn't take the money in the first place.
Do you see any areas within either the Title I, the Race to the Top, or the SIG grants that are flags for services that the grants provided that with the funding ending, there will be a lack of those services or an inability to have reached what some of the goals of those grants were? Do you see anything, any flags whatsoever with that funding ending?
I would have to defer your question to the experts in the schools who work with those schools and know what's going on on a day-to-day basis.
The one area that potential as the grant decline is professional development. We are required to implement part of the SIG grant certain professional development. And I mentioned to you the area of vendors and partnership could be the school that I part of the that have extended learning. They require 200 hours. Those grants bring dollars to pay for that. That could be what I was just saying. As you know, everyone in this board know that the Race to the Top have generated a significant amount of dollars that, by all accounts, the federal government have invested in an unprecedented way in the last 4 years, in 2009, through the stimulus money. And sometimes you go through a period of time in which you see heavy investment on the part of the federal government. There are folks that believe that quite possible that the kind of dollars of investment that you've seen from the federal government, that they likely to decline. And yes, we applied through the New York State for the funding sources for those dollars at the federal government. Now, as far as Title I is concerned, that's remain, by all accounts, it could go no significant change, but it is not expected to increase. Rather, if it's one thing through sequestration, is expected to decline because of, you know, the federal government is still not in agreement about renewing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so in which you find Title I, Title II, and Title III. So what I'm saying to us, and what I have asked, that we're working as we project to close the structural budget gap, is for us to be cognizant, because in the past we have entered into a situation that some of the services, once you introduce it, people want to maintain it. Right. Sort of like Ms. Murphy was saying in here, when you introduce an expeditionary learning model, you continue to develop certain approach, and instead of, let's say, pulling back from, let's say, having internal coach, you might continue using outside coaches, and when you want to make the adjustment, you hear a lot of concern. And I think that's the nature of your question. What's going to go away that's going to have an impact on families, students, and the people who work here?
You know, one specific thing, if you remember from our parent meeting, where we talked about, you know, the little bump in the title fund because of the one-time large rollover. So that was about a $4.2 million issue, you remember? So that did translate into, in this budget, that there are fewer, coaches in this budget. And that was one of the board's questions we articulated, and we answered how many of this, but that was a specific issue there. They were funded by that bump, and that bump went away. Now, part of what the feedback from our stakeholders, though, is to the extent that you have other grant opportunities coming down the road that could restore those things, to the extent that we can start the school year and have these things in place and not have those folks hired, and the grants come in November or whenever. So what we did to be thoughtful about that, we advanced some of our title monies that we had intended initially for the summer of 2015 to help provide some transition. So we still have, we basically restored some of that loss that would have otherwise been experienced. And so by doing that, you have an additional 15 coaches or that would have been lost otherwise. And then we're looking at those grant opportunities along the way. And then because they are, grant funded, not general fund, that we have an opportunity to pursue those grants to the extent they happen, then we can take a step back and revisit this situation as we go forward. So that's a case where we're trying to be deliberate, sort of getting that feedback, because literally otherwise you'd hire these folks in November, and then there's a whole daisy chain of displacements that occurred.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one last question. The professional technical services line on page 19 of section 3, Mr. Superintendent, I know that you had been talking in the past about reducing, that's the line where our contracts and vendors are. And I know that you were talking about reducing that, but I see that there is an
Which page?
Page 19, section 3, page 19. From the actual in 2012-13 and to propose something around, about $4 million of an increase, it seems. So can you talk about that? I know that was one of the things that you were trying to, that was a priority of yours, is to reduce those vendor services. And so why do I see an increase in the proposed budget?
Yeah,
which line?
Do you have a, we might have to, we'll go into the line in here and see what account for it.
Professional technical services.
It's not mine.
I'm talking about from the actual of 2012-13.
We can provide a written summary of what's in there year to year, so that you can see what you'll find. There's a few drivers in there, like a handful of drivers, and I think rather than try to verbalize them with numbers, which would be difficult, we'll provide a written summary for the board.
But is that, Mr. Superintendent, are you continuing to work on reducing that, the number of vendors that we have that may not be lending to?
Well, as an example, one of the big drivers this year are the community-based organizations in the full-day pre-K program. That's where these dollars are.
Okay.
Okay, we have to give you
so we could give you a full summary so you get a complete picture of that.
Okay.
So what you'll see is you'll see a reduction in other areas of vendors, but it's being overwhelmed by the increase for the CBOs and the pre-K program. That's good.
Okay, that wouldn't have been under a line item for pre-K or 7?
Well, it's just rolled up here in this. This is a summary. This is the summary section, right?
Oh, okay.
And because the full day pre-K was implemented in February, so there's a substantial increase, going into the 14-15 year. That was part of that $7 million increase.
Okay.
So a substantial piece of that is our piece with our CBO partners.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions, section 3? I think we're done then. As people pack up, I'll remind you that Thursday is our first public hearing on this topic. It's generally facilitated by the board president.
I won't be
Oh,
in
you won't
town.
be here, I guess it's facilitated by me then. Those of you who are in town, though, please make every effort to be here to reflect that it's our constituents that are coming to talk to us. Our next budget, our next deadline for the next section of the book, 4 through 6, I believe. Is it 4 through 6?
I think it's just 4 and 5 because 4 is all the schools.
Okay.
5 are.
Sections 4 and 5, due by next Monday, this coming Monday. And the next budget deliberation is 2 weeks from today, the 15th. And that's pretty much far enough out on the calendar to keep us in line, okay? Thank you, everyone, for what I thought was a smooth meeting. I assume it was smooth while I was gone, too. And I appreciate your commitment of time. Thank you so much. Yep. There's nothing here that